So let me thank the organizers for inviting this keynote on AI and rule of law using patterns in judicial data to measure and address judicial bias. So let me begin with a definition of justice. We can think of equal treatment before the law and equality based on recognition of difference. That is, there's a set of X's that should lead to the same predictions or predictability of outcomes. The X's should improve the predictions. And a set of W's that should not. We tend to think of the X's as consequences of our actions based off the control principle and the merit principle. The individual should be responsible only for events under their control. And the W's might be race, gender, expressions of one's identity, but also events outside of one's control like football, weather, the judge's lunchtime, or preceding case. So behavioral anomalies offer an intuitive understanding of feature relevance. Psychologists have documented many effects, only of moderate size in the lab. The settings where judges are closer to indifference between options are more likely to lead to detectable effects of behavioral bias outside the lab. So let's suppose this parabola captures what the judge thinks is the right sentence. Small deviations cost little. The judge isn't sent to jail. Now suppose the parabola flattens. 8 months, 8 years. I don't care. I'm indifferent. Then as my preferences over the legally relevant factors wanes, the influence of extraneous factors grows. So we can think of measuring behavioral anomalies as documenting revealed preference, indifference. So I'm going to illustrate using data collected the last few years, all the cases, 8 million judge votes since 1891 in the circuit courts, 2 billion 8 grams, 5 million citation edges. In the district courts, we have millions of sentence decisions linked to the digital corpora of their opinions since 1923. In the Supreme Court, with the speech patterns and oral arguments since 1955, the clipped identical introductory sentences and ratings of their traits, together with data on asylum courts, prosecutors, boardroom courts-martials. In the Global South, the data comprise a natural laboratory to study normative judgments. You're right or wrong, good or bad. So how do judges make decisions? They follow the law, of course, but not only. They're human and they're influenced by the weather. Judges deny refugees asylum when it's too hot or too cold. The time of day. They grant asylum more before lunch and less after. The defendant's name. They assign longer sentence lengths to defendants whose first initials match their own. The defendant's birthday, when they do the opposite and give the gift of leniency. NFL football. Judges are more lenient the day after their team wins rather than loses. Sequences. Judicial leniency grows for later cases and with judges' age. Snap judgments. We can use machine learning to predict asylum decisions with roughly 80% accuracy the date the case opens and when it closes. Elections and wartime also affect decisions. But not only, there's the gambler's fallacy. So in a sequence of coin flips, it's not that uncommon to have streaks of ones or streaks of zeros. In other words, any two sequences are equally likely, but people tend to think the sequence at the top is more likely than the one at the bottom. So if I'm an asylum judge and have the gambler's fallacy, and I grant asylum too much in a row, I might worry I've become too lenient. If I deny asylum too much in a row, I might worry I've become too harsh. So I might actively negatively autocorrelate my decisions and just trying to be fair and just. And up to 5% of decisions are reversed due to the gambler's fallacy. In the Supreme Court, the first sentence of lawyers' oral arguments are identical.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court.
So we played these clips for subjects to rate on attractiveness, masculinity, confidence, characteristics that previous research deemed relevant in social settings. And we found that male petitioners below median in masculinity ratings are 7 percentage points more likely to win. And Democrats vote against masculine-sounding lawyers, but Republicans vote like Democrats in less ideological cases. Now, profit-maximizing firms would tend to erode this correlation, but the negative correlation is stronger in more masculine industries, consistent with their perceiving masculine-sounding lawyers as winners. So we ran a debiasing experiment and found that information reduces misbeliefs, and incentives further reduces misbeliefs, which highlights two channels for the negative correlation: information and incentives. So what about gender? Female lawyers are also coached to sound more masculine. So are our findings restricted to male advocates alone, or do they extend? Well, it turns out it extends. Less masculine males and more feminine females are more likely to win. So if masculine is the opposite of feminine, the pooled results will be stronger. So what is it about masculinity that may be something that HR screens for? We played the clips in reverse, and we found the strongest correlation in masculinity for the forward and backward clips, suggesting there may be something deeper when it comes to masculinity. We also found the strongest correlation for masculine perceptions of the non-Southerners and whites who may comprise the HR. And results are robust for lower heterogeneity and the best ML Supreme Court prediction model, which also happens to select the perceptions when they're available to be included. So besides the voice, there's text. We can take the judge's opinions and reduce them to a low-dimensional vector space. And we find on the left, the female dimension is associated with migraine, hysterical, morbid, obese, terrified, unemancipated, and battered. And on the right, the male dimension is associated with reserve, industrial, honorable, commanding, conscientious, and duty. So we can do this judge by judge. We see that Justice Scalia was an outlier in gender slant. And in the circuit courts, judges with more gender slant vote against women's rights issues, assign fewer opinions for females to author, cite female judges less often, and reverse male judges less often. So there's at least 5 ways for machine learning to diagnose judicial inattention: early predictability, comparing predictive accuracy the date the case opens and when it closes; behavioral anomalies, merging in extraneous factors for causal inference. Now, if a judge is inattentive to legally relevant factors, they may also be inattentive to reversals. And their implicit risk rankings may be closer to random, and they may display difference in indifference for certain groups. So I'm going to illustrate with asylum judges. After surprise reversals, judges grant more asylum and hold more hearing sessions. Now, the judges significantly vary in their responsiveness to reversal. So do less attentive judges have implicit risk rankings closer to random? Are they closer to flipping a coin? So I'm going to conceptualize this with a graphic from the criminal justice domain, where these kinds of conversations have been more salient. So suppose I'm a prosecutor making the decision to screen in an individual into the criminal justice system or send them home and drop the charges. If I'm a robot prosecutor releasing defendants based on the risk score, you might imagine the harshest prosecutor screening in the most individuals and letting home very few defendants would only be releasing the quote-unquote low-risk defendants, the R1s and R2s. On the other hand, if I'm a very lenient prosecutor sending home most of the defendants, you might expect to see the R4s and R5s. Now, if instead I were flipping a coin, you might expect an even distribution of predicted risk scores throughout the distribution of prosecutor leniencies. In addition, for any group of prosecutors, you might expect a similar distribution of R1s to R5s. And it turns out this appears to have been the case for human prosecutors in New Orleans, where the distribution of risk scores for the released defendants is similar for the most lenient and the least lenient prosecutors. So we can turn this perspective to look at asylum judges. Are the most lenient asylum judges letting in the most individuals in the US, only denying the quote-unquote riskiest applicants, who, on appeal, see the lowest reversal rates? On the other hand, if I'm a really harsh asylum judge, rejecting most of my applications, we might expect a higher reversal rates of their asylum denials. So we might expect to see a diagonal. So we see on the left that judges have strong habits. A judge who's generally lenient in other cases is likely to be lenient in a given case. On the right, we can assess the implicit risk ranking. Now, if judges are ordering their asylees, the most lenient judge, letting in the most applicants in the US, should be rejecting only the quote-unquote least safe applicants, the ones whose appeal success will be lower, which is what we see in the blue for the more attentive judges, but not for the less attentive judges in the orange, who may be more prone to other extraneous factors, such as the weather. We can actually unpack this a little bit more, and we see that unrepresented parties bear the brunt of mood effects, experiencing roughly 10 times the effect size of an upset NFL loss. We can actually think about recognition and dignity brought about by social movements. Labels play an important role in defining groups to gain respect. And in New Orleans, we can see the distribution of risk classification by police, B, N, and W, and the distribution of N is growing over time. Now, there are certain terms that are offensive due to the long association with slavery, segregation, and discrimination. And a recent study found that a split ballot experiment found the term homosexual, as opposed to gay, increased negative attitudes about LGBT rights. So in New Orleans, we can see that the effects appear only for African Americans labeled as N, and is absent for those labeled as B. And it's making salient this concept of revealed preference and difference, where if certain groups not recognized, not respected, the judges may be closer to indifference between options, making it more likely to see the effects of these behavioral biases. We can also see difference and indifference for asylees from the global south, from Africa, and difference and indifference for Black defendants by bail judges who release along the right diagonal for the white defendants, but not for Blacks. So why do we see the wrong diagonal for Black defendants? We can look at this question simply with means of the data. If you look at the screening decision, we can see it increases the racial sentencing gap. So on the left, the conditional Black-white sentencing differences, so conditional being screened in, you can see that there's a traditional gradient, that Black defendants have a longer sentence length. But on the right, once you include those that are sent home and impute a 0 for the effective sentence length, the disparities magnify. And that's because the Black arrestees are less likely to have their charges dropped. And the effects are quite large on a log scale. Now, is statistical discrimination the reason for the disparate screening? So one way to investigate is to use the identity of the prosecutor. And we can see that white screeners are taking in fewer cases. They're more lenient, sending home more individuals. Now, if they're targeting the most severe cases, we should expect the ones they screen in to have longer sentences. But on the right, you can see that the white screener cases are actually more leniently sentenced, suggesting that white and black screeners are letting in different cases. And that's not about statistical discrimination. Now, maybe the white prosecutors are just more lenient in general, screening in fewer individuals that render shorter sentences. But when they're a trial prosecutor, they obtain longer sentences. Most district attorneys are elected, and they want to appear tough on crime. So why are the white trial prosecutors more effective in this goal? Well, it appears attributable to the judge's race. So on the left, we repeat the same figure from the previous slide, that white trial prosecutors achieve longer sentences than black trial prosecutors. But on the right, you can see that black trial prosecutors and black judges render similar average sentence lengths as white trial prosecutors do. And only for the black trial prosecutors having a white judge, we see the shorter sentences. And these effects are quite large on a log scale. What's also troubling, if you take the first three pairs of columns, we see the traditional longer sentence lengths for black defendants relative to white defendants. But in the final pair, we see that black trial prosecutors and black judges eliminate or reverse the racial sentencing gap, which is hard to explain as statistical discrimination rather than in-group bias. So we see a number of factors associated with judges' decisions, but then there's been another that's been extremely influential. By 1990, 40% of federal judges had attended an economics training program. This training program started in 1976 as an intense 2 to 3 week course with lectures by Nobel Prize winners, Milton Friedman, Paul Samuelson, and many other luminaries. So we obtained a list of all the attendees from an article written by a former director. In this article also included testimony from the judges expressing their appreciation, how much they felt they became a better judge. And the results of the seminars were dramatic. We can see economics language used in academic articles become prevalent in opinions. We can see economics trained judges changing how they decided and impacting their peers. We can see economics language traveling from one judge to another and across legal areas. And economics training shifted by 10% the direction of the votes on economics cases. If you teach judges that markets work, they'll vote to deregulate government. If you teach judges that deterrence works, they'll become harsher to criminal defendants. In the district courts, when judges were given discretion in sentencing, economics trained judges immediately rendered 20% longer sentences relative to their non-economics counterparts. Economics trained judges increase racial sentencing gaps and also gender sentencing gaps, which is consistent with the use of stereotypes under information constraints that magnify pre-existing differences. Now, what is it about stereotypes, indifference, the use of a virtual coin to make a decision to arrest that violates our notions of justice, equal treatment for the law, and equality based on recognition of difference? Perhaps it's not just the expected outcome, but the variance of outcomes. That is the recognition of the merits of the case, the actions that you took to achieve a particular legal outcome. So what can machine learning do about this? Cognitive science and psychology suggests we have limited and imperfect reasoning capacities. Gambler's fallacy, mood, time of day, order, age. They all highlight the fragility of the courts, where even in the US, there can sometimes be only 7 minutes to decide a family's future. But recent innovations have opened up new opportunities for deliveries of justice, increasingly digitized large-scale data sets, machine learning to produce interpretable data from unstructured text, prediction models of decision-making to better understand biases and address them with digital interfaces. So the usual narrative to decision support, such as AI, is backlash. So a recent study found that when judges were given decision support, it rendered greater disparities, not because the decision support, if followed strictly, would have increased disparities. In fact, it would have reduced it. But the judges selectively paid attention to the decision support for the stigmatized group. So what about an incremental approach, leaning into the ideals of the modern self, Enlightenment ideals of self-knowledge and self-mastery, and romantic ideals of self-realization and self-expression? Policy discussion tends to evolve around AI replacing humans or suggesting the optimal decision, as if from a black box, but consider instead an incremental approach that shows decision makers their predicted self and then uses predictions of errors to nudge. So this actually comes from an earlier AI literature on bootstrapping. And the idea is that we could present this as a default, where the decision maker is free to disregard this default. The decision maker can also request an explanation now given in terms of the user's past history. And the decision maker can also express and convey their private information through a dialectic. So stage one, we can imagine the AI as helping pre-fill forms, offer the decision maker the best predictions of themselves using a model that only contains the legally relevant features. So we can assess the judge versus this bootstrapped judge. For instance, if I'm very attentive to legally relevant factors and have some private information that's not in the model, then the human judge will do better than the predicted judge. But if instead I'm very behavioral, cognitively distracted, having W's affect my decisions, then the actual judge would do worse than the bootstrap judge. In addition, this default helps increase consistency across similar cases by giving the judges the most relevant reference points, cabining the influence of these extraneous W's. Seeing the predicted self can also leverage self-image motives of pro-social decision makers. And in addition, deviating from the default facilitates more type 2 conscious deliberation. So in stage one, we lean into the self-image motives of a judge. In stage two, we can see if a deviation from a default is more likely to render an error from a model using all the available features, X's and W's. And this could accompany this deviation with a nudge to be more attentive, to spend more time on the case, to make a better decision. So a nudge, instead of a checklist of all the possible W's you need to keep track of, imposes less bandwidth, conserving their time and energy to focus on more novel and complex cases. So here we lean into the self-improvement motives of a judge to make better decisions. In stage three, a decision maker may want interpretable machine learning and request a reason for why a deviation may lead to mistakes. So here the AI is more of a general coach providing outcome feedback, but people still have autonomy. They're in control of the conversation. They're able to choose, for example, when the feedback is given. As previous research has documented, they respond better to this feedback when it's actively selected. So here we lean into the motives of self-understanding of a judge. Now, it's possible that the AI's suggestion doesn't take into account some reliable private information that a decision maker may have access to. And when this is the case, it might steer the decision maker off course rather than correcting for inconsistencies. So we can actually have a two-way conversation. It's not just the algorithm giving information to the judges, but the judges can express and convey this private information. To learn, the AI can learn from the user. In stage 5, you might have the AI bring in other people's decision histories, serving as a platform, as a community of experts. You see what the algorithm predicts that others would do. Again, accessible as a drop-down menu. You can seek the advice from a specific decision maker, or you see a statistical distribution of others' decisions to protect individual privacy. So here, we lean into the motives of ego, comparing yourself to the others, or possibly knowing that you're being shown to the others. Only in stage 6, you have the current status quo, where you recommend or make available the quote-unquote optimal decision, if any, something that the experts have decided. Now, there can also be stages 7 through 9, among many others, for example, or WebMD for litigants, letting them access this information, access to justice, and increasing transparency. Or stage 8, use it to train the novices who might make more mistakes, or use the feedback from the dialectic stage as a recommender system with A/B testing to generate personalized causal inference. So when someone has this private information and conveys it to the AI, it could then in turn feed this information to the others that are similar types of cases. So notice this approach addresses many of the common criticisms, potential bias, since we start out by assessing the judge with their predicted self before proceeding, reduced autonomy, because it's a support tool. You can always deviate from the default. Erosion of learning. There's this opportunity to continually learn and also access the platform of experts. Transparency and interpretable machine learning for explainability. And instead of baking in the past, now we're explicitly asking the user why they deviate. So here's a proof of concept. We can see a drop-down menu. You can select the asylum judge and get a prediction of the decision that you can then potentially impact evaluate its effects on trust, perceived indifference of lawmakers, as well as applications, decisions, reversals, speed, and disparities. We can do personalized interventions. So show a judge the summary statistic that they're worst performing on relative to others. But so they don't get depressed every time they log in, maybe what they're most improved on relative to their previous self. Or recommending actions to improve on certain aspects of the self. Or self-reflection, social emotional learning exercises, where they give advice to someone like themselves and then grade randomly chosen pieces of writings to see its effects on decisions and disparities. So the great transformation is something that Carl Polanyi referred to as the mentalities changing to become more economical. We can see in state court opinions and in Google Books, in the 1800s, retribution was more popular, then overtaken by rehabilitate, and then by deterrence in the 1960s. And we can see a corresponding uptake in the federal judiciary, language similarity to law and economics, articles, conservative votes, voting against government regulation, and citations to Richard Posner. And at the same time, an increasing polarization since the 1970s, voting along party lines relative to any dissent. So maybe AI will bring about the next transformation of law. Maybe it'll reduce polarization. Maybe it'll shift the focus to legitimacy and fairness of law. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A.